Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here in this session. I've been listening to presentations since morning, and it's been I must say it's been rather refreshing and very exciting to listen to such varied presentations and very interesting work being done by young scholars. So it's a great pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to have Jomo with us. Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram really needs. It's very difficult to introduce him. He has such. It's his biography is so long that if one has to really describe his varied interests and the work that he's done, it'll take the whole session. But very briefly, he's been Assistant Secretary General at UNDESA. He's been Assistant Director General of Economic and Social Development at FAO. He is a prolific writer. He's written like 100 books and innumerable articles, and writes regularly on a range of issues in popular media platforms. He received the Leontief Award in 2007. He's been one of the founders of the Ideas Network, and I think over the last 20 years or so has been really instrumental in bringing together, in particular, economists of the South as part of the Ideas Network, but also more generally, and has engaged with issues if you just look at his books, he's just dealt with such a wide range of issues that it's really it's a great opportunity for all of us to have him address these young scholars. When we reached out to him, we requested that he should make a presentation essentially talking to young scholars about the kinds of things that they should be looking at given the current challenges and development issues that the world is facing, in particular third world, less developed countries are facing. So it's really nice to have Jomo with us here, and I'm sure everybody is looking forward to listen to you, Jomo. So without wasting any further time, may I invite Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram to address this gathering. Over to you, Jomo.
Thank you very much, Vikas, for the very kind and generous introduction. Thank you also to the ISSER for this invitation to join you today. I particularly appreciate this invitation for two slightly different reasons. One, because I no longer teach in a university, so I have less and less opportunity to meet with young researchers and scholars. And secondly, I also have been trying to network, as Rawal emphasized, with a lot of people, particularly in Anglophone Africa. So what has happened is that I have lost contact with India, and so this is a very important opportunity to renew that contact and to get a sense of what the younger generation are doing. Let me just begin, if I may, with a few reminders about what I find to be helpful. I do appreciate that many of you, especially those of you who choose to go into the academic track, will be under a lot of pressure to specialize and to demonstrate your prowess in particular areas, especially, for example, in terms of a particular area and particular methodologies and so on. Nonetheless, I think it's always important for us to remind ourselves that the way we organize our knowledge is not necessarily how the world is organized. And we have to avoid that kind of narrowness and to recognize that many, many issues are interrelated. And so what I'm going to try to do over the next few minutes is to try to introduce you to a range of issues and to reminding ourselves that these issues do not lend themselves to very easy understanding. Now, nonetheless, you will be under pressure to, to do whatever you need to do, but it is very important, I think, to keep in mind the larger context of things. And the second thing, I think, is that the whole question of research funding is often a problem. And so very few of us are in a position of being able to set and justify our own research priorities, but that it is insofar as we are all working under constraints, it is important to explore the limits and to stretch the limits in order to be able to justify our own research priorities. As you know, for example, in the last decade and a half, there has been a great deal of funding for randomized controlled trials, especially if the sources are the US and the UK. Nonetheless, I think there are great limitations to this. I won't get into all those issues now, but it's important for us to remind ourselves that these are all facts. One of my great friends, the first chair of the council for advisory council for ideas, was the Tandika Makandavire. And Tandika actually wrote a very interesting paper showing that how a range of over the last half century, in fact more than that, there were various generations of scholars from Africa who were trained in and specialized in particular methodologies and particular issues. But by the time they completed their PhDs and all that, their issues were passé. For example, there was a great deal of money at one time in the 1960s and 70s. There was a great deal of concern that developing countries had just too many people. So there was a great deal of money for population studies. And then there was a phase when certain types of planning were being encouraged. And then subsequently cost-benefit analysis and so on and so forth. But in this very nice paper, he actually shows how all these steps basically became irrelevant. And we must avoid this kind of obsolescence, because the obsolescence is not necessarily deliberate, but nonetheless, it is the consequence of a certain type of planning of research priorities. The third thing, of course, is to be very mindful that theories do not fall from heaven or any place like that. They emerge and have particular histories, and it's important to recognize that their relevance is often very, very limited. So, for example, we often hear Adam Smith being quoted, and we always told about Adam Smith's invisible hand. Now, for those of you who have taken the actually read The Wealth of Nations, including all the footnotes, you will find that there's only one mention of the invisible hand, and that is in the footnote, and it's particularly in relation to international trade. But you would think that the whole book is about invisible hand, about market forces and so on. So there's a lot of misconception because we find ourselves at the mercy of people who choose to selectively tell histories, selectively to quote, and so on and so forth. Fourth issue, of course, is the appropriate research methods, and I've already referred to this when I was talking about research priorities, and we have to resist the temptation of mimicry. It is often it seems to be an easy path, but when you simply mimic without understanding, without contextualizing, we end up being it becomes problematic. And the last problem which I'd like to highlight is that we tend to learn from the North, from the global North. And one of the big problems I faced as a student many, many years ago was that I found much of what was being written, frankly, quite irrelevant, and so I actually, purely by chance, one day came across something called the Economic and Political Weekly, which many of you know. In those days, it was a different kind of a paper. That was the air-flown edition, which was very lightweight, and so on and so forth. And every week, I would almost religiously run to the library and wait for this latest edition to come out, because there were very, very interesting debates on the mode of production in Indian agriculture, for example, where there was a young graduate student, Utsa Patnaik, who now has retired as a professor, who made her reputation basically by pushing the older people very, very hard in terms of their understanding of what is going on in Indian agriculture. So I think it's for me, it was a very eye-opening experience. And likewise, I learned a great deal about the debate. For example, around the same time, I was learning a great deal about the debate in Latin America, about the so-called dependency theory and its limitations. And there were so many versions of dependency theory, which I learned about. Once I could read some of the languages. In this case, of course, Spanish was the most important language, and so on. So I would strongly urge you to make a determined effort to learn from the South. And unlike in my day, it's much, much easier now, thanks to the advent of the internet and so on. So let me quickly move on to some of the other issues. And now I'm having trouble changing my slides.
Jomo, you can go back to that presentation mode.
Yeah.
Just, you're not on the presentation mode. Just click on that icon on the bottom right.
Okay, sorry. So you haven't seen you didn't see the first slide. Okay, here we go.
Yeah, this was seen. Now you can go to the next. Now with page down. Yeah.
Okay, so this is basically what I'm going to do. Okay, I'm starting off with a proposition, the slightly unusual proposition that most developing countries are in the tropics. And most of the developing world is in the tropics. And I'll come back to this in a moment. Now, let me emphasize what is painfully obvious to many of you who are in the tropics. You know that the temperatures change has become often increasingly difficult and sometimes even unbearable in many places. And this has worsened the problem. So more and more people are using fans, even air conditioners much more. And all this, of course, means often the burning of fossil fuels, which worsens the global warming and so on and so forth. Okay, what I think is very important, especially in terms of agriculture, is the fact that you have a much more extreme weather events as well. It's not just temperature rise, which has been important, of course, but all this extreme weather has become important. Some of you might remember that about over a decade ago, there were these terrible floods in Pakistan. And these are phenomena which many people refer to as once in a century phenomena, but in fact, they are recurring more and more often. It's not once in a century. Even the phenomena which are quite old phenomena, such as El Nino and La Nina, have become much, much more pronounced. And so planting seasons have been affected. In my own country, Malaysia, for example, in the main rice growing area, two planting seasons had to be cancelled simply because there wasn't enough water in the reservoir. So this gives you some idea of how serious some of these problems are. And I think it's very important to recognize that the small island developing states, they are called SIDS, there are almost 50 of them. And most of them have very small populations. But the fact of the matter is that despite having very small populations, at places such as the UN, they actually count for quite a bit. And this is true, for example, of the Maldives and so on and so forth. But what we see is much more extreme weather situation, and I'll come back to this later when we are talking about the issue of climate finance. So what we also find is that the whole question of climate finance, which is often seen as the main solution, even though this is heavily contested. The whole question of climate finance has been very much skewed. That much of what has been promised by the rich countries has simply not materialized. Just to give you some sense of how little has actually materialized. If you look, for example, at what was promised 12 years ago, or almost 13 years ago, when I was working at the UN, the rich countries, specifically the president of France at that time, Nicolas Sarkozy, another man, Prime Minister of Britain at that time, Gordon Brown, and the president of the European Commission, all promised at least 100 billion. Now, 100 billion was much less than what was needed, but it seemed to be a promising start. Instead, we find that to date, 12 years later, less than half of that was actually ever delivered. And we find that most of the money has been earmarked for what is called mitigation. Okay, mitigation basically to slow down climate change, which will basically benefit everybody in the world. I'm not saying that mitigation is not important to do, but there's very, very little for what is called adaptation, which is an immediate concern and priority, particularly for poor countries and particularly for people who live very precarious existence. And there is nothing for what is called losses and damages. So much so that it's not even recognized by some people as a legitimate category. So if you look around, for example, in addition to the water problems which I referred to in my own country, for example, which are faced by many other countries in the tropics, you find they say Bangladesh and Vietnam, precisely because they are very low-lying, they have seen saline water from the sea seeping into the rice fields. And this has affected productivity tremendously. In many parts of Africa, you find that desertification has been accelerating, and many areas which were previously forested became grasslands. Now they are arid grasslands. And so we find that all this is actually contributing to worsening the problem. I once had the privilege of actually flying from Europe, from the Mediterranean to South America, to Buenos Aires. And because there was a volcanic eruption, the volcanic cloud was moving around. So it was impossible to land in Buenos Aires. So the flight was postponed, and the flight, which is normally at night, was postponed to the morning, and we flew over the Sahara. And as I was flying over the Sahara, I looked out and I realized that the Sahara was, once upon a time, a number of river basins were all over the Sahara. You could still see the remnants of it, from 30,000 feet in the sky. So, it's a reminder of what can happen. Of course, that took place over thousands of years, but it can happen much, much faster, as is already happening, for example, in the Sahara, in the Kalahari, and in other places which are desert. In Rajasthan, for example, I'm told that some of these phenomena are also taking place. Now, let me move on to discussing something else, which is the whole question of tropical trade. There was a man, Arthur Lewis, probably the first colored man to get the so-called Nobel Prize in economics. And in 1969, before he got the prize, he gave what was called a Bixel lecture. And Lewis basically pointed out that the prices of tropical agricultural goods had been declining over the last century and a half. Yeah? Just remember that this was 1969, that after the Industrial Revolution, tropical agricultural goods were declining compared to temperate agricultural goods. And young, well, maybe now not so young, Turkish woman economist, Bilge Erten, updated this data about a decade ago, and you can find it on the internet. And basically, she shows that this phenomenon continued for the half century after Lewis completed his work. Okay, so you basically have a situation where we now think that the kinds of goods which we produce in the tropics were terrible. But in fact, this was not always the case. Many of you do not know that last year was the 500th anniversary of Magellan's death. Okay? But Magellan was trying, guess where he was trying to get to? He was trying to get to some place called the Moluccas Islands in Indonesia, because this was where the most precious spices of his time were to be found. And there was a big struggle between the Portuguese and the Spanish for the control of the spice trade. And there was a division of labor between the division of the world between Portugal and Spain. And eventually, that sort of lasted for about a century. But then the Spanish Empire, which included the Netherlands at that time, basically began to weaken, and it was the Dutch who emerged. And the Dutch, unlike the Portuguese and the Spanish, although there was no monarchy. So this was the period of the so-called Dutch Republic. And for those of you, for example, interested in the history of art, you can look at Rembrandt's very famous painting called The Night Watch, where you have all these businessmen, merchants, pretending to be nobles. They're all dressed up and so on and so forth, posing for Rembrandt. And this was how they saw themselves. But this East India Company was a very, very important source of the wealth of Holland. And Holland was really quite dominant. When you think about names such as, Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or his cousin Teddy Roosevelt, these are all Dutch names, and a whole range of other, Van Buren and so on and so forth. American presidents were all Dutch names. And it was Holland which was really quite significant at that time. And the Dutch controlled Manhattan. And they named it, the southern end of Manhattan, they called it New Amsterdam. Now, the other place which was called New Amsterdam in those days was what we now call Petersburg, St. Petersburg. In those days, and later on became Leningrad for almost a century, and now it's called Petersburg again. But these were names given to, so New Amsterdam was very popular because everybody was trying to emulate the new emerging imperial power, which was also bourgeois, and sort of attractive in that sense. So you have, you can see, and the worst ever Dutch deal, the Dutch, I don't know what it's like over there, but if you ask any Indonesian, Indonesians will tell you all kinds of jokes about how stingy the Dutch are, and even in English, if you take somebody out and give them a Dutch treat, it's not a treat. A Dutch treat basically means that you take somebody out and you make the person pay for themselves. Okay, it's not, okay? So that gives you some idea of the reputation of the Dutch in those days. Okay, and there are many other jokes about the Dutch, which I won't get into right now. But the point I'm trying to make is that Dutch are famous for making very, very good deals, in those days. And they made one famous bad deal. And that was to give up Manhattan, to give up, which by the way is a Dutch name, to give up Manhattan, give up New Amsterdam, and exchange it, guess for what? For an island in Indonesia. Okay? A small island in Indonesia, which was reputedly the source of spices, and that for them was much, much more valuable than. So I think it's very important for us to remember that these terms of trade are nothing God-given. It's not due to market forces and so on and so forth. It's due to a range of issues. And it's very important for us to recognize this and to recognize that. So it's very important to recognize the complementarity of geo-economic factors in understanding the declining terms of trade against developing countries. Moving on very quickly, let me move to the whole question of diseases. You will notice, and everybody is now much more health conscious than ever before, you will notice that there are so-called, WHO has a category of so-called neglected diseases. And if you look at the neglected diseases more carefully, you will find that almost all of them are tropical diseases. And there's a great neglect of that. And after Jimmy Carter was no longer president of the US, he set up a foundation, and he almost single-handedly managed to get rid of guinea worm disease, through the research done funded by his foundation. Now, Bill Clinton, who was responsible for pushing the TRIPS agreement, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, as part of the WTO, after he was no longer president, expressed some remorse because he did two terrible things which he expressed remorse for. One was that he basically insisted on free trade for Haiti. So Haiti could no longer protect its rice production. And so when the earthquake happened in 2010, Haiti was defenseless. They had no source of food, and it was really in very, very bad shape due to the reforms, which so-called trade liberalizing reforms, which Clinton had imposed. The other thing he expressed regret for, and this was really fought for by Nelson Mandela, was the whole question of intellectual rights. So much so that he actually bought the rights to a couple of antiretroviral drugs and started producing them in India. I think it was Chipla, which was producing the drugs, and thus we find that from a situation about 25 years ago, where almost 1/3 of the population of South Africa was HIV positive, we have seen the situation come down to under single digits as far as Southern Africa is concerned. So, I think one has to recognize that even the neglect of these diseases has got a lot to do with money, and an issue which we'll come back to later when we consider some of these issues. So when you think about something like malaria, malaria has not been eradicated in the world, partly because there wasn't, until about 30 years ago or so, much of a research effort to eliminate malaria. Now, in Europe, malaria has largely been eliminated simply through very, very simple reforms, drainage and sanitation. And this was part of the reason why a century ago, Benito Mussolini became very popular in his country, Italy, precisely because he had succeeded in eliminating malaria, among other public works programs which he initiated. In many tropical countries, even in India, I have noticed in the past, and not only in Assam, but even in the south, we find that the colonial plantation managers and the officials all wanted to stay at high altitudes, where the mosquitoes often did not fly up, were not around. And in Africa, you will notice that all too many capitals in the colonial period were established at high altitudes. Of course, even during the colonial period, the non-colonized country like Addis Ababa, this was also true. But if you look at Kampala, if you look at Nairobi, you look at Harare, formerly known as Salisbury, and so on and so forth, they were all at fairly high elevations. Why? Because the mosquito does not differentiate between the color of the skin. And so colonial plantation managers were very, very concerned about getting malaria. So you will see that this bias, even in public health, in the development of medicines, has got a lot to do with geography, but it's not geography itself. It's geography combined with everything else, and this, I think, is very important for us to recognize. So when we think about what has been happening in the tropical zone, now it is further complicated by the emergence of new types of categories. And one of the important categories which has come up is to the last 6,000 years or so as the period of the so-called Anthropocene. This has become quite fashionable. The last UNDP, 2 years ago, the UNDP Human Development Report was dedicated to promoting the idea of the Anthropocene and so on and so forth. But I think we need to, while there's a lot of enthusiasm for talking about the Anthropocene and so on, I think it is very important for us to continue to recognize the continued importance of geography and the biases inherent in that, as I tried to suggest in this particular slide. Now let me move now to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is one more instance of why it is so important for us to consider these issues in their totality. You cannot understand very many issues if you do not recognize the totality of the issues involved. And what is quite important in my mind is that every situation is different, and it's very tempting but also problematic to draw simple analogies, to fight the last battle. There was a book which was very, very popular when it first came out, arguing that the US lost the Vietnam War because they thought they were still fighting the Korean War. And while I don't agree with many of the premises of that book's argument, I think it's useful to think about the problem of getting misleading analogies. And this is particularly a problem for people like us, because we read, we think about the past, we reflect on the past, and it's always so tempting and easy to think about parallels and to sort of, because the parallels are familiar, and to ignore those things which are less familiar. So the whole question of herd immunity, as you know, was a huge problematic issue. I don't want to get into all that because a lot of that has been quite well established by now. But one important difference for us to recognize is that one of the blunt policy instruments which became very popular in much of the world, including the developing world, were the imposition of what are called stay-in-shelter lockdowns. And unfortunately, this created a huge number of problems. Now, in East Asia, however, this was not the case. It was certainly the case in Wuhan, mainly because in Wuhan, they only recognized the novelty of the problem, basically in January 2020, about 2 years ago. Before that, they thought they were just dealing with a flu, and the whole question was how to identify the correct flu and so on and so forth. So they only identified the specific characteristic that they were dealing with a different problem right at the end of 2019. And that's why it's called COVID-19, as you know. Now, in Wuhan and in the surrounding provinces, there are three. Wuhan city is the whole industrial capital of China, and there are surrounding provinces. And of course, many people from all over the world, including from Vietnam and India and so on and so forth, were actually living in Wuhan. And so many of the cases, the early cases in places like Vietnam and India, including especially Kerala, actually came from Wuhan. But in Wuhan, they managed to contain the whole situation within about 3 months. And if you look at the numbers last year, for example, in China, the number of deaths attributed to COVID-19 was a total of 2. Yeah, number 2. Okay, I mean, it is very, very. People don't quite recognize the achievement of not only China but also other East Asian countries. Well, Japan plays around a lot with its policies, but if you look at what happened in Taiwan province of China, if you look at what happened in South Korea or the Republic of Korea, you look at what happened in Vietnam, you look at what happened in Laos and so on and so forth, and arguably even in Kerala. You basically avoided stay-in-shelter lockdowns, but it didn't mean you did nothing. Okay, it didn't mean you did nothing. It didn't mean that you surrendered to developing herd immunity, which is Boris Johnson's original approach, and which was in an indirect way, it was the Trump's original approach. So Boris Johnson only changed his mind around mid-March in 2020, when he realized, thanks to a study by the Imperial College of London, that they were projecting about almost 2% of the population of the United Kingdom would perish due to COVID-19. It was only then that he panicked and he realized how the enormity of the problem, and he changed this. Now, this kind of bias against learning from East Asia is not new. And there are a lot of biases against learning from India and other parts of the world, but it generally involves the developing countries where there are these kinds of biases. So, for example, if you think about the way the Asian financial crisis was handled, I've spent a lot of time writing about it, but other people in India, for example, C.P. Chandrasekhar and Jyoti Ghosh have also written about it. What did they do when the Asian financial crisis happened? They blamed it on so-called Asian values, and one after another, the chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan, the Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, or at that time Deputy Treasury Secretary, sorry, and the third one was Michel Kamdesu, the Managing Director. They all blamed it on Asian values. And there's no empirical basis and nothing. It's simply prejudice. But when people like that say something like that, you will find any number of academics will trot out they will give you some rehashed version of Weber or somebody else to justify these kinds of views. And those views become the dominant views, and unfortunately they prevailed for almost a decade until the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. And then suddenly you found that the same people who were condemning what was happening in Asia, they were calling for a strong fiscal response, which is basically what countries in some of the countries in Asia did. So I think it's very important that, this view that, oh, it's the libertarian West who wants freedom, etc., etc., and in all these fellows and people in Asia who love dictatorships and so on and so forth, somebody will come out with, the Asian mode production, the Oriental despotism, and so on and so forth. Everything will find its day, will be trotted out to suit the prevailing views of the most influential people in the world. Instead, of course, we know that, what is called FTTITS, was very, very successful. But the most important things, in my view, was to have an all-of-government approach, a holistic, comprehensive approach. And I think one of for Indians, I think the most well-known case, of course, is what was done in Kerala, and also more recently, what seems to be happening in Tamil Nadu. Okay, so you find having an all-of-government approach, a holistic, comprehensive approach, as well as what I call a whole-of-society approach, involving the people. Because you can't just order the people to do this and that without explaining to the people what is involved and why they are being asked to do what they need to do. So what do we have now? We have a situation, unfortunately, where the biggest problem right now to the vaccination and the protection of people in the developing world, of course, is the intellectual property rights. Something which is actually fairly new and not something which is very old. It was only introduced into the World Trade Organization when it was created in 1995, and it's just over a quarter of a century old. So we find that this has become the principal objection. Only earlier this week, I was involved in a stupid debate, where people were saying, oh, developing countries cannot produce vaccines, cannot do this, cannot do that. That's why we can't let them do it, because they can screw things up and so on and so forth. And I had to remind them that, AstraZeneca was producing a lot of vaccines using Serum Institute of India and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of mythologies which are backed up, prejudices which are being backed up by so-called social science. And it's very important for us to challenge that and to expose it. And this, I think, is also quite important. Now, let me quickly move on to saying that we have a situation in the world today where there isn't enough international cooperation. There isn't enough international cooperation. And the big problem, of course, in the old days used to be the Cold War. And after the end of the Cold War, you actually had a period of what is best described as US sovereigntism, where the US felt that they were unmatched and they dominated the world. It didn't last very long, but it lasted about a decade until 9/11, and that again changed the world. And so, but we find that kind of view that America is the chosen nation, God's chosen nation, and so on and so forth, is still very, very powerful. It's still very powerful, and we need to deal with these kinds of prejudices, not by simply calling them names and so on and so forth, but through reason. And I think reason should be our greatest strength. Now, the reason for mentioning the Cold War is because sometimes the Cold War can result in something which is not bad. So the Soviet Union challenged the US around the late 1970s to try to eradicate smallpox in the world. And the US accepted the challenge, and lo and behold, a decade later, smallpox was history. There's no more smallpox in the world, okay? And of course, the other thing to remember, of course, is that almost until fairly recently, all these new discoveries, including things which are involved in the so-called mRNA vaccine, were all basically the subject of, they were not subject to what do you call it, patents. And the reason why AstraZeneca vaccine was relatively cheaper and often the preferred vaccine for that reason was precisely because Sarah Gilbert and her team at Oxford did not want any patent for any royalties for their discovery. If you look at the so-called CRISPR technology developed by 3 women, at least the 3 women got the Nobel laureate for it over a decade ago. It was, again, they never demanded anything. So, the 3 most important things in developing the mRNA vaccine were all relatively free for the companies involved. The CRISPR technology, the genome sequencing done by done by China, and of course the other thing was the research in other matters developed by the American National Institutes of Health. So I think what is important to remember is that we really, these issues cannot be looked at and understood without recognizing the larger context in which it's happening. And I think that other issues, of course, which are relevant from an economic point of view are the special drawing rights and the challenges in ensuring that special drawing rights are a help to poor developing countries. They're not automatically the help to benefit the poor developing countries, but they can be, and this is very important for us to be able to reason and explain how this can happen. And I think it's very important for us to raise the correct slogans. The Davos people who are now more influential, just at the moment we thought that the Washington consensus was becoming quite discredited. Now we have the so-called Davos, the lords of the universe in Davos telling the rest of the world what they should be doing, defining the slogans and so on and so forth, IR 4.0, building back better and so on. I think we should use the opportunity to try to change the discourse to talk seriously about building forward better. And this, I think, is important for us to popularized. So there should be relief and recovery, but also reform should be very much part of the agenda. Now, I'm running out of time, so I'll run over the rest of what I have to say relatively quickly. I think many of us do not fully appreciate, and the biggest culprits are the lawyers themselves, how law and property rights in particular are so crucial to understanding the distribution of income and wealth and so on and so forth. There's some very good work initiated by a woman named Katerina Pistor, who did her original work. Her original work was on comparative law in Southeast Asia, and now she's a professor at Columbia, but she has written an excellent book looking at law. But it's more than just property rights. Even contractual rights have become very important. And there are many types of property today, or economic assets, which do not exist except in law. And so it's very, very important for us. Now, this law, the same law in different contexts, or similar laws in different contexts, can have very, very different consequences. In the US, for example, during the last decade, there were a lot of so-called share buybacks. But this was a phenomenon which was largely American. It didn't happen in most of the other major financial markets. So we need to recognize similarities, but also differences. And this, I think, is the challenge for us. Let me quickly move on to emphasizing the point I was making earlier about intellectual property rights. I mentioned earlier that Nelson Mandela was the one who initiated the fight for the so-called public health exception. And now the Indian government and the South African government are fighting very hard to, now with the support of over 100 developing countries, to get a waiver. There are many. The main reason for getting a waiver is because the law, the exception which was introduced after Mandela was no longer president in 2001, which was a compromise after 9/11. The law is basically requires patent by patent negotiation by every single country, and it will take forever. It'll take forever to negotiate everything which is needed. So this, I think, is part of the reason why the South African-Indian proposal is extremely important to support. But there's a lot of mythology as to why it can't happen, including what I will describe to you earlier in the webinar which I participated in earlier this week. Moving on very quickly, I think it is important to recognize that food insecurity is very, very, very much a problem which has been worsened not only by climatic and other issues, but it has also been by the efforts by big agricultural companies to try to control increasing shares of food production. Now, this may be less apparent to you in India because of the specific history of India and so on and so forth, but it is a very major problem in developing countries. For example, in Africa. Africa, there were many countries have been signed up enthusiastically for something called AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, financed basically by Bill Gates and the Rockefeller Foundation. And this happened about a decade and a half ago, and basically output increases have been very, very poor, very, very poor. There's very little evidence to suggest anything good has come out of it. In fact, in some places, the situation has been bad. The only exception, it appears, and there are other reasons explaining this, is Rwanda. And so they took the Minister of Agriculture from Rwanda, who's an entomologist, and made her in charge of the Food Systems Conference. Now, it's good. I appreciate the fact that she has a lot. She may know a lot about entomology and so on. And entomology continues to remain a major issue in agriculture because of insect pests and so on and so forth. But she was basically mouthing slogans provided by the Gates people and the Davos people. And so we cannot allow this. So this hints at a big problem in governance. and the weakening of the developing country caucus, the so-called G77, the almost the death or virtual death of the non-aligned movement meetings, which are basically desperately needed now that you have a new Cold War. And so I think there's a lot of room, even for people interested in things like international relations and so on, to begin to recognize the issues involved. It's especially important to recognize that the kinds of that rich country, as far as food security is concerned, rich countries almost all finance and subsidize their farmers, whether it's the US, Japan, or Europe. Okay, there are heavy subsidies for farmers. But when developing countries try to have tariffs, because most developing countries cannot afford anything but tariffs, they are basically discouraged from doing so. They are penalized for doing so, and this is part of the inequity of the deal as far as the World Trade Organization is concerned. Many mistakes were made, and now there's almost no mechanism by which to correct those mistakes. And this is part of the problem which we have from an international relations point of view. Now, the last point I want to make is basically to propose that school feeding programs are a way to organize society, civil society. Some of you may be mainly interested in working with civil society, and part of the reason why I find school feeding programs to be particularly attractive, and Professor Rawal can speak to this as well, is the fact that not only are you averting child hunger, but now we know much more about malnutrition, and the fact that that there are many micronutrients which many people lack, and as well as and as a result of that, you have what is called a hidden hunger, a lot of other problems, and a lot of ill health today is attributable to this. So this and the changes of diets of many of us is really quite astounding. And there was a recent book by Professor Lustig, which basically says that at least in the US, over a period of 25 years, the average weight of the adult population increased 25 pounds. Okay, an average of a pound a year. I'm not saying that it did happen in that way, but that's the average. Now, I'm not so sure what is happening in other parts of the world, but we have a very serious problem. So we have all kinds of diet-related non-communicable diseases as well. And this, I think, is also important. But the reason why is that you can link a school feeding program initiative, which is important for the future generations, which is important for the children, and nobody can really oppose a school feeding program in principle, and link it to farming practices, and ensure that the farmers have a stake in it. You know, that you are producing much more food, and especially food which is very important and relevant to you. In all too many countries, not so seriously in India, all too many countries, many of these programs are ultimately become a means by which you give contracts not to farming cooperatives and so on and so forth. You give contracts to big agricultural companies. Even a relatively large country like Indonesia has allowed Cargill to basically run the school feeding program. So you are able to mobilize consumers, the parents, you mobilize the farmers, and you have basically the makings of a broad popular alliance to fight for these kinds of issues. So let me conclude with this, and I hope that this is something which might be of use for you to consider. And I hope this introduction has, sorry I ran over time a little bit, but I hope it is useful for you to begin to realize the challenges and how it is important for us to be able to set our own research agenda. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jomo. This is brilliant. Professor Sundaram has both painted this very wide canvas and, in fact, given us a really interesting agenda for research. All the issues that he's talked about, issues that also sort of speak to social scientists from various disciplines. He's talked about issues related to economics, of course, but also health, on issues related to world politics, issues which are important from a historical perspective, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting, but I particularly want to highlight I think one important point that sort of underlies a lot of what he said was the importance for scholars from third world to be willing and have the courage to engage in critical inquiry, not to accept as received wisdom what's coming from the first world, but to look at concrete realities and to look at everything critically and understand them in an original way, and not be, to do that boldly and courageously. So I think I'm afraid there is not very much time left for a discussion, but if there are, given that it's such an important opportunity for all of us, if somebody has one or two quick questions, we might be able to stretch the session a little bit, if there is a question or two for Jomo. I'm sure the audience are overwhelmed with the large number of things that were talked about. You'll have to raise your hand for the organizers to unmute you, I think, if there is anybody. Yeah, I guess people need time to process so much, such an insightful talk. I think people need time to process this, because there's so many interesting ideas that you gave. So I think let's close this session. Let people mull over the ideas that Jomo's talked about, and Jomo writes once a week, twice a week. He is writing all the time. So please follow. He's given a link to his Substack blog where he posts. He also publishes regularly on Ideas website, on IPS network website. So yeah, I'm sure people would follow his writings and reach out to him for any comments or discussions that you may want to have. So thank you very much, Jomo, for this wonderful talk, and
thank you, because
hand over to the organizers for closing this session and going on.